Right, welcome back to part two. It's 15:18. We've got about 15, 16, about, give or take a minute for our prelims at the beginning. So let's say 17 minutes left of this second part. I think I'm still sharing my screen. If someone can confirm that for me, I'd appreciate it. Anybody? If you're still seeing leasehold versus freehold. Great, thank you. What we're going to do now is we're going to move into the second part of the workshop, which is a little bit less in size of time, but no less important. In fact, probably as important at the beginning bit. What do we know so far? Let's have a quick recap. We know why we have a lease. We know the reasons for having a lease. We also understand the differences between a lease and a license, and we understand the differences between a leasehold and freehold. Now let's talk about leases. So these you're looking at the screen here are just some examples of the types of leases that are out there, and I've included these in your handout on Padlet for your unit criteria, your unit study area. Gross lease, single net lease, operating lease, net lease, double net lease, triple net lease, finance lease, percentage lease, green lease, and gross lease. Open question to any of you. Can any of you tell me what any of these leases mean? If you think you've got some sort of idea what you think it means, just shout out. Anybody? Carolina.
So I was reading about the net lease, never heard of it before, but it's quite interesting. It's about basically it's adjustable lease. Is it right? It's just a commercial lease?
It is, that's right.
Yeah. So basically it's a highly adjustable commercial lease.
Yes. It's probably the most common form of commercial lease on the market, and requires you as a tenant to pay a portion or all of the extra costs incurred by the property, and that includes taxes, utilities, rents, rates, and everything else, maintenance costs as well, and it is very flexible. It's probably the most common. Why do you think it's the most common lease out there, anyone?
Is that because it's less hassle for the landlord?
It's because it's a money earner. That's why. It gives great flexibility in order to add costs on. So, when you go to, get a lease for somewhere, for example, when you want a gross lease, that you're able to plan out what your costs are, and it's a net lease, and you say, well, you want a gross lease. The bottom line is a landlord isn't going to say, oh, right, okay, well, I'll turn it into a gross lease then. A net lease enables that flexibility and adaptability by a landlord to add, costs in there, essentially. That's not to say that every net lease is just a license for a landlord to print money. Of course not. But it does enable the landlord to protect themselves, to ensure that there are any additional unforeseen overheads in order to keep that property safe and free of any possible sort of danger, so to speak, maintenance costs and so on, that they're able to transfer those costs. Anybody else?
Hi, Mike, it's Karen.
Hi, Karen.
I was looking on the for things like the full service lease or gross lease, whichever, because it's the same. Obviously, that covers all the property operating expenses from the tenant's point of view. So any taxes, utilities, maintenance, and stuff like that. So basically, the landlord makes any amendments by using that particular rent from the tenants to offset the costs.
Exactly right.
So often that payment can be higher because the tenant has nothing else to pay, and it covers, say, like in certain times in the winter when the heating's on full, you've got no additional increased costs at that particular time, possibly for the first 12 months or so. The downside is obviously there can be a yearly increase dependent on any works that might be done on the property or anything like that, so that landlord isn't out of pocket.
Exactly right. Well done, Karen. That's a really good explanation of a gross lease, which we'll reiterate in a summary in just a minute. Exactly right. Gross lease, all in. Now in the FM world, because I'm just looking now, FM. Of course, we're all FM. Crikey, what am I talking about? I thought it was level 5 management leadership. In the FM world, what sort of model would be in parity with a gross lease for property management? Anybody that was FM orientated? Anyone? NG provide this. Bellrock provide this. Karen, you don't. Tom, this is out of your area. No, it's not out of your area, actually. You would have dealt with some of this. Tom Abel, there are some schools who have this sort of, this managing model. What would it be in the FM world? Anyone? Come on, guys. This is
PFIs. Would a PFI be one?
No, it wouldn't be PFI. Think about it. Gross lease, all in, all inclusive. Eat as much as you like. It's like going to one of these eat as much as you like Chinese restaurants. Pay one thing, get in, that's it. What model in the FM world is in parity with a gross lease?
TFM.
Could it be if you took a total facilities management package?
Well done.
Something along those lines.
Yeah,
well
TFM.
done. TFM, exactly that. Total facilities management. And we all know what the advantages of that are for the client, but also what the disadvantages are for us when it comes to service side managing it. And Karen gave a great example there of differentiation or offset of additional costs or lower costs offset by higher costs elsewhere during the year, and balancing out to ensure that any sort of lack of income because heating isn't used as much as it is in the summer actually is offset by a sort of flat rate. That's no different in TFM, Yes, Natalie, you got your hand up.
Just because I mentioned PFI, would it come under any type of leases then? And what would that be?
Well, why don't we ask Karen? Because I think you'll find that Karen's area of responsibility was possibly a PFI. I'm not sure. Karen, was Basford, was that a PFI?
No, that was internal facilities, but there is the possibility of the new City Hub that we're opening in Nottingham that could potentially come under a PFI. So that might be a contractor. We have got one where we've got the Adams building, I think, is under a PFI because it's a grade 2 listed building.
Yeah, will be, yeah.
So basically they do look after that building for us. So there's certain sections of that particular building that we can't really do any works with at all. So we have to build within walls so that we can basically just, even if necessary, put things like notice boards up and posters and stuff in some areas because we've got to keep the specifics of that grade 2 listing. Anything like lighting, stairwells, access routes, we can't change any of those building specifics because it comes under that PFI. They're responsible for that. They pay for all that. It's often the detriment is the fact of the turnaround time.
Yeah.
For them to be able to often respond, to be able to enable us to continue with the educational side of it, because we've got areas that might come out of service because you could have a leak or something like that, and it depends on what damage it is and what the costs are.
Yes.
So could it be considered as a lease then, a PFI from a client side or tenant side? And what would that be if it is?
Well, a PFI is almost a lease and license to produce a function to manage a building, right from the very word go. That's the whole point of a PFI is to by the government, is to use other people's money to build it, to manage it, and everything else. And of course, in the building and the managing, in the managing side of things, that is where the money is earned. It is a license to print money for some organisations. This was one of the downfalls of Carillion under many PFI initiatives, where they undersold themselves in order to secure the PFI, with sort of, let's use an FM term, a sort of risk of return, essentially. Will the risk being we'll undersell ourselves now for a greater return in managing the property over a 25-year period. So when it comes to the property management, and it comes to the service charges, and it comes to that particular property, you would usually find that on a PFI, as Karen's given a good example there, that actually it would be all inclusive, purely because it is a license for that developer to earn more money. No one's going to turn down an opportunity to earn money. And so, there are certain constraints, and it becomes very difficult to manage a property when it is under a PFI. On a similar vein with Karen's example, one of my properties that was in London, actually in Aldgate, and it was just down the road from a huge Roman in London, a Roman. What they're called, foundations, Roman foundations, and these Roman foundations are in the gardens, in the back areas of some of these buildings in Aldgate. Well, because of the land and how it's changed over the 1,000-odd years, the wall extends underneath the road and went straight through this corporate building that I was managing as part of my role, and that was a Roman wall. And not only was it you couldn't go near it, couldn't touch it, couldn't anything, you couldn't do anything with it whatsoever. It was completely out of place, and it also gave the public to come in and walk along the wall through this big corporate building and that out the other side. So and that whole building there, that whole building that I'm talking about was actually built under a PFI purely and simply because of the importance of the ruins or foundations that it was being built around, because it was protected, and the organisation that built it, I won't say them on air, but they were absolutely fleecing us for managing that property, and there was nothing we could do about it whatsoever. It's a license to print money, which for the private sector is great, and for the government, because of course they get a return on it. Good, let's move on. Karen gave a great example of what a gross lease is there, and I think that pretty much sums it up. So I'm going to leave that on the screen, and then I'm going to click on that little speaker icon. Just listen to this guy for 2 minutes, and again, just summarises the summary of what Karen has informed us on.
Our question today comes from an office tenant who asked, what is a gross lease? Well, typically that's going to refer to a lease that includes the utilities, it includes the taxes, it includes the insurance, it may even include the janitorial and everything. So you're paying one lump sum of rent payment and all the services are provided, sometimes called full service. Now, in different markets and different areas, it can be a little slangy sometimes what leases are referred to and what they're called. So I'd very carefully look at the lease and make sure you understand all the expenses that you might have as a tenant or a landlord. But basically it's referring to a full service lease. You're paying one payment and everything is included.
Point of note for you all, and that is that notwithstanding Landlord and Tenants Act 1954, which is specific to the to England, Wales, Northern Ireland. In fact, actually, hang on, wait a minute. Northern Ireland, I believe, is slightly different, and so is Scotland, I believe, but England and Wales definitely. The majority of terminology in property management is international. It doesn't matter whether it's America or here. If you say gross lease over here, it means the same thing in America. And as you heard Karen say earlier on, sometimes that can be referred as a full service lease or a full maintenance lease, but essentially it means the same. Property management, the language of corporate real estate, is international for obvious reasons. We are an ingrained world. We collaborate and we contribute to each other's businesses. And we have plenty of American and Europe and Middle East and Asian companies in the UK, and they have to rent properties as well. And half the time they own them, but they have to rent properties and they have to lease properties, and so there is a common language. There is an ISO, and that eludes me right now. We'll pick up on that on another learning outcome. But the language and the definitions of the language is the same. Moving on then, what I was going to do now was I was going to get you all to go away and research one of those. But seeing as Karen gave a great example of gross lease, and we've had a bit of input, etc., and looking at the time, I'm going to move on. Suffice it to say that it's your responsibility to understand what these different types of leases are. Again, I point you towards the Padlet. I point you towards the current unit that I've created for you. I point you towards the handouts that I've created for you, which will, again, add further context when you are self-direct learning. Final section, let's just have a very quick look at legislation and initiatives. Now, you can't really take a quick look at legislation and initiatives purely and simply because they are so long. I mean, it's just like saying, let's just have a quick look at the Health and Safety Act. There are careers made out of understanding the Health and Safety Act and the implications for business in the workplace. There we go. There's the alarm. We'll have our few minutes of admin that we've done at the beginning on top. It is a huge area. Suffice it to say that it is important that you understand the basis of what the legislation provides, not necessarily intimately what it defines. Let me give you an example. The Landlord and Tenant Act 1954, well, you know why that exists. It exists to protect the landlord and the tenant under a provision for an agreement for a tenancy of a particular location. The Climate Change Act, you understand what that is from, from corporate social responsibility and sustainability. The Estates Agents Act essentially puts down very strict guidelines on how estate agents can act on your behalf, and a bit like the Financial Conduct Authority, they stipulate that the estate agents must always act on the basis of the best for their client. Now, in brackets, of course, there's a caveat there, because who's the estate agent's client? Is it the person selling the house? Or is it the person that's walked in wanting to buy a house? So there's almost a conflict of interest. If you read the Estate Agents Act 1979, which I think I've put a link in for you, it's like all legislations. It's very, very deep, very in-depth, and covers absolutely every single area. There are solicitors out there who have a whole career based upon just the Estate Agents Act, as they do with the Landlord and Tenant Act. Defective Premises Act, Occupiers Liability Act. Of course, we know as FM practitioners that Health and Safety Act pretty much governs everything. It's almost like a gotcha card. If all else fails, Health and Safety will get you, and is designed to get you if you challenge it. Lots of different types of legislation. Again, there is more legislation out there. What can you find? The Landlord and Tenant Act 1954 is a complex piece of legislation, and it governs the rights of landlords and tenants of premises for business purposes. Not all deeds or agreements are within the LTA 54. And when you are responsible for a property, I'm not reading out the rest of it, by the way, that's there for you to look at in your own time. But when you are responsible for a property, or a new property comes onto your portfolio that you're given the responsibility of looking after, your first question, FMs, should be: is this property within the LTA 1954? If it is, who's representing us on the corporate real estate? If it's not, and it's outside of the agreement, where are our protections with the provision of facilities? This is how property management and facilities go hand in hand. And it's an unwise property manager and an unwise, or sometimes inexperienced, facilities manager that does not understand how they can join and dovetail into one another. As I said, it's your turn. You should be going out and finding out now, as per the resources I've provided you, what are these other areas? I believe criteria 1.3 dictates that that you need to evidence your understanding of what these particular legislations are, and many other legislations. That doesn't mean to say you create an exhaustive list. I'd much rather you probably look at 2 or 3 and have a good grasp of what they mean, rather than the intimacies of what they define. Let's summarise at the end of the workshop. So leases are required by law. 3 years or over must be a formal deed. Less than 3 years, doesn't need to be a formal deed. Some leases are actually verbally agreed, and it's an unwise organisation that creates the conditions for a property to have a tenure by a tenant that is not formally by lease, which is written over 3 years, signed, witnessed by a solicitor, etc., etc. A lease provides exclusive use for the use of the property. That includes access by a landlord, but a license does not. A license gives you the right to conduct a particular function or operate in a particular area for a set specific period of time. Think of the driving license and think of leasing a car in the same context. Leasehold is under a term. Freehold is owned. Although leasehold sometimes can be under an exceptionally long period. You can come across leasehold for 99 years. I think 99 is the maximum, actually. I think. Again, look it up. I think. Does anyone know if it's longer than 99 years as the maximum? I think it's 99. Anybody? We'll move on. I'll find out and I'll come back to you. There are many different types of leases. We just looked at one. There's lots of others there. And I've given you some examples and produced some handouts for you in the Padlet area to add further context. And finally, leases and licenses are covered under many legislative acts. We've just briefly touched on the Landlord and Tenants Act. And in context, it's a bit like saying the Health and Safety Act 1974 was designed to make sure that everyone's safe in the workplace. Yet actually, if you go along to the Health and Safety website, or if you go into your FM Padlet library and have a look at all the different legislation, regulations, codes of practice and everything else, you'll realise it's a very, very complex area. Although actually, its meaning is fairly simple: the safety of people in the workplace. It's the same with LTA 54, designed to protect the landlord and the tenant under a strict set of permissions and preconceptions for property tenure, but it's far more complex than that. Cool. Well, look forward to researching obligations because that is an area that we haven't covered, and an area easy for you to find out on what those obligations are. Again, I've created a handout for you, but do research via Jane Wiggins and of course the internet. But look out, I'm looking forward to reading that. Completing your Learning Objective 1-on-1 file, which will be in your inbox on Monday morning, 8 o'clock. It will be there for you. You need to engage with that. If you're behind by still got work to do with the other units, then I would strongly suggest that you put some time aside and get them done for you, because what I want you to do is move on. The majority of you have completed it, but if you've got problems with it, then do reach out to me and we'll see if we can't carry on this unit in tandem and then create an additional learning support for you with the remaining work. Next workshop will be in 2 weeks' time, and it will be on this unit, of course, and may well cover 2 learning objectives, with one of those learning objectives being accepted as done on this actual workshop. Look forward to that. Finally, everybody, are there any questions for me? Anybody? You can all turn your mics off now or turn your mics on.
Just to confirm, we're addressing the points that you just showed on the last slide. The top 2 points, is that what we need to do in 2 weeks, or the whole of LO1 that you set?
No, what we've just done there, as I've just said in the beginning, what you've just done here is the whole of Learning Objective 1, and what your assessment on one file will stipulate that. What I haven't covered in this one is obligations of a landlord and tenant, which you will need to do as part of Learning Objective 1. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay, fine. Thank you.
Cool. Anyone else? Okay, great. I'm going to stop the recording. Thanks very much for your attention. I'm going to stop the recording. If you just hang around afterwards, we'll all just take our mics off and I'll just make sure that you are all still alive after listening to me for an hour and 40 minutes. Okay, stopping the recording.